If you've ever lived in a city, you might be wondering why they developed the way they are, why there's a financial district or a poor neighborhood and a rich neighborhood, and why tall buildings are surrounded by other tall buildings and so on. So why did they? What made them this way? Here are some of the forces that have shaped cities. First one, location, location, location. Cities tend to be in places of interest, especially the older they are, often next to water, which is why the biggest cities in the world are all next to either a river or a sea or a lake. You need water to grow a city, and if you exclude aqueducts, which artificially bring water from far away using a slight slant and simple gravity, all cities before 1800 needed some form of water, may it be underground or above ground. London, Paris, Rome, Nanjing, Beijing, New York, it was built before 1800s after all, Cairo, Calcutta, etc. All of these had some river, some underground aquiferous form of water. The other thing you need for a city is sources of food and acceptable temperature. This is why you don't really find cities or neighborhoods above a certain latitude or in deserts, unless water, oasis, or lush floodplains blunt the effects of the heat of the desert. The second thing to look at is the history of the city. Any city that existed before 1500 or so had some form of walls or defensive structures. This often determined both the maximum size of a city, as walls, the protective envelope around the core of the city, limited the surface area of the city. This drove buildings up, more on this later, as well as the structure of the city. The dense urban cores of many towns and cities remained unchanged for centuries, even as walls became obsolete due to the tight spaces and lack of scope for expansion. This often led to old cities or historical districts. In newer towns and cities that became so after the 16th century, or those that didn't have walls, developed as far as you could walk. London in the 18th century, before the advent of any rail transport, only really extended about a mile out. This was called the square mile, and as a result, due to the rules of the time, bodies were buried 1 mile out from the town centre, a place called Mile End now. Very much considered close to central London now, but back then it was a graveyard. Spooky, right? Third is income. This meant that the structure of towns and cities was often determined by how far one was willing to walk. In economics, the theory goes that everybody pays whatever they're willing to pay for something, in this case housing. So if you're rich, you'd want the closest place available, and everyone lower in income from the richest person on would get priced out, and so forth. This creates structure based on income. This is why in many European cities, the best and most expensive houses and flats are in the center. In fact, this rule doesn't apply just to distance, but also to height. As buildings in London, for instance, grew taller, before lifts existed, the richest would buy the closest apartments to the ground. You can tell this because of window sizes. Yes, window sizes. Because heating was expensive, and still is depending on who you ask, and windows were often how most of the heating escaped a room or a building, the size of those windows determined how rich you are. Obviously, the newest cities around the world have only existed since the 1800s or so, and even more recently maybe. In other words, since mass transit, those are trains, buses, trolleybuses, and subway, metros, or even cars, which means many of those cities are much wider and larger than their predecessors. Thus, suburbs were born. Whereas in many older cities, you might have one high-income area and the rest of the town. In newer ones, you find a flurry of suburbs, all with a spectrum of incomes. The fourth thing is supply chains. For products, banks near markets and ports. In London, it's no coincidence that the old financial district is a stone throws away from the docks. But also for people. You have theatres and entertainment close together. And in smaller neighborhood centers, you find streets lined with bars and pubs and so on. You get a sort of supply chain. Similar thing with banks happened, where you've got the central bank of a country. You often find other banks around in the same part of the city, and then law offices not too far off. This is why financial districts often have high-rise buildings because of the demand and the money involved. Accountants, consultants, and so on, there's a whole ecosystem. Fifth comes transport. People follow transit lines. If there's a train that gets you to work in 35 minutes and a bus that gets you to work in 45, you will try and take the train. This means that those routes and wherever a train station happens to be on that route will be very desired by commuters. And so you have clustering around those transit lines that lead to certain districts. Nowadays that may be less common because you can change lines, but for many decades there were specific routes that drove or took workers to specific factories and mines and industry. This often created miners' towns and industry towns, which today are no longer as common. But for most of the 20th century, the center of cities became increasingly increasingly polluted and less desirable, and thus an exodus occurred, where suburbs became the place to live if you had the cash and could afford the transport. In many ways, the way the city developed is like a tree's rings. It tells us the story of how it grew and what are the forces that have shaped it. And I find that that's a really useful way of thinking of cities, because it tells us the forces that have shaped individual cities rather than looking at them as one monolith. As always, I hope you found the video useful. Drop a thumbs up if you liked it, a comment, and subscribe if you loved it. See you next time.